June 7, 1944. Normandy, France. General Fritz Bayerlein is looking at the smoking wreckage of Panzer Lehr Division's approach columns and writing something in his field notebook that he will never say in public, that the American soldier is not what German intelligence told him to expect. Bayerlein is one of the most experienced armored commanders in the German army, a man who served as Rommel's operations officer through the North Africa campaign and who has now been given command of Panzer Lehr, an elite demonstration division formed from the instructors of the German Army's armored training schools and equipped with more Panther and Panzer IV tanks per regiment than any other armored formation in the Wehrmacht's order of battle. He has been ordered to move Panzer Lehr from its assembly area south of Paris to the Normandy front during daylight on June 6 and 7, in defiance of his own professional judgment that daylight movement in range of Allied air power will produce the attrition that his tactical experience tells him is inevitable. He has made this argument through the command chain, and the argument has been overridden. He has obeyed the order as the professional military system requires him to obey it, with the specific and unhappy compliance of a man who believes the order is wrong and who has been unable to change it through the proper channels, and who is now going to discover whether his professional judgment or his superior's professional judgment was correct. And now, on the morning of June 7th, he is looking at what Allied tactical air has done to his columns on the roads of Normandy. The burning vehicles, the dead horses and dead men in the ditches, the craters in the road surfaces that have been forcing his armor to detour into fields that their ground pressure has been churned into impassable mud, and he is forming the first of the assessments of the American military that he will eventually provide to the United States Army Historical Division in the interviews that constitute one of the most significant bodies of German military professional judgment on American forces in 1944. What Bayerlein is thinking on June 7, 1944, and what he will eventually say in the specific and candid format of the post-war interview, rather than the constrained format of wartime operational reporting, is that the Americans have built something that German military planning had not adequately projected: a combined arms system of air, artillery, and ground forces, whose integration is not merely additive, but multiplicative, whose total effect exceeds what any assessment of its component parts would project. The air power alone is formidable. The German army has been fighting under Allied air superiority since the North Africa campaign, and its commanders have developed doctrinal responses to the aerial threat: the dispersal of vehicles and equipment, the movement of columns at night, the use of reverse slopes and forest cover to mask concentration, that mitigate the air threat's worst operational consequences. What has not been mitigated, and what Bayerlein's June 7 experience demonstrates with specific and operational evidence, is the combination of air power with artillery and with ground forces that advance immediately behind the effects of the fires, in a way that denies German defenders the specific interval between the end of the air attack and the arrival of the ground assault, in which their doctrine prescribes the recovery and repositioning that makes the defensive position viable. American Combined Arms Doctrine closes this interval. It closes it by coordinating the air attack, the artillery preparation, and the ground assault in a time sequence whose compression is a doctrinal choice rather than a physical necessity. And the compression makes the combined effect something that the German defensive response, designed against each element in succession, cannot organize against when the elements arrive simultaneously or in such rapid succession that the sequential response has no time to execute. This assessment, and the assessments of the dozens of German general officers who participate in the Foreign Military Studies program through the 1950s and into the 1960s, will be classified by the American military, whose professional development they are intended to inform, and will not be systematically available to historians and the public for decades. What those assessments say about the American soldier in 1944 is one of the most revealing documents in the history of the Second World War's Western theater, and it describes an opponent that the German military, which had been fighting the most capable armies in Europe for 5 years, had genuinely not projected and had genuinely not been prepared for. The German army that is defending Normandy on June 6, 1944, is the product of 5 years of continuous combat on multiple fronts that has made it the most experienced large military force in the world. Its general officers have commanded in Poland, in France, in North Africa, in the Soviet Union, in Italy, and in the Balkans. They have fought against the French army and the British army and the Soviet army and the American army in its early and inadequate manifestations in North Africa, and they have formed from this experience a professional body of knowledge about what each opponent does well and what each opponent does poorly that is more systematic and more operational than any comparable body of professional military knowledge that the other major armies of the war have accumulated. The German army knows what good soldiers look like because it has been fighting them, and sometimes fighting them very badly, for 5 years. It knows what it means to fight the Red Army, which has evolved from the catastrophically disorganized formation that German armors sliced through in the summer of 1941 into the operationally sophisticated force that defeated Manstein's best defensive efforts at Kursk and that is driving westward in the summer of 1944, at a pace and with a combined arms capability that the German military of 1941 would not have projected as achievable from the starting point it observed in the summer of that year. It knows what it means to fight the British Eighth Army, which has its own specific tactical characteristics, a methodical, preparation-intensive approach to combat that minimizes casualties at the cost of operational tempo, a logistics system that reflects the specific and long-standing British military investment in sustainment over exploitation, a command culture that its German opponents consistently describe as capable at the operational level and conservative at the tactical level, in ways that the Germans have learned to exploit by attacking before the British preparation is complete. It knows what it means to fight the Polish army, the French army, the Greek army, the Yugoslav partisans, and the specific and various forms of military opposition that the German expansion has encountered in 6 years of warfare across the full geographic span of the European continent. When German general officers in the Foreign Military Studies interviews compare the American soldier of 1944 to the other opponents they have faced, the comparison is made from this specifically and extraordinarily broad professional baseline, and the consistency with which the assessments return to the same specific characteristics of American military performance: the learning speed, the logistical capacity, the combined arms integration, the individual courage, is the consistency that broad comparative experience produces when the thing being assessed genuinely stands out against the full range of available comparison. It is not the comparison of men who have been fighting in one theater against one opponent. It is the comparison of officers who have fought the Red Army and the British Eighth Army and the Polish Army and the Free French, and who are now assessing the American soldier against that entire prior body of adversarial professional experience. The assessments they produce are, for this reason, more interesting and more analytically significant than any single theater comparison could be. They are the professional judgments of men whose professional breadth gives them a reference frame that most military observers cannot match. The Foreign Military Studies program begins in 1945, when the American Army's Historical Division starts the systematic collection of German military analyses that the Army's doctrine development and historical research functions need. The program runs for 16 years, generating more than 2,500 individual studies and interviews by the time it substantially concludes in the early 1960s, covering every significant German operational command and every theater in which German forces have fought against American forces. The generals who participate, including Bayerlein, Hasso von Manteuffel, Hans Speidel, Siegfried Westphal, and dozens of others whose names are attached to the decisive operations of the Western Front, are asked specific and professional military questions about American forces and American tactics and American command, and they answer with the specific and professional honesty of men who are no longer in a political environment that constrains their assessment, and who are often in the interview room with American historical officers, finding it possible to say things that they have been thinking for years, but have not previously been able to say in any format that records them. The program's outputs are classified because they contain specific operational assessments whose intelligence value the American military does not wish to share with other nations, including allied nations, in the specific Cold War environment of the 1950s, in which the Soviet army that the German officers have been fighting on the Eastern Front is now the potential opponent against whom American military planning is being developed, and in which the German officers' assessments of Soviet tactical and operational capability are at least as strategically valuable as their assessments of American performance. The assessments of American performance are classified alongside the assessments of American vulnerabilities, because you cannot discuss one without revealing the other. And the classification that protects the vulnerabilities also protects the admiring assessments for decades. The American public's access to what the German professional military actually thought about the American soldier in 1944 is therefore limited through the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s to what the German generals have published in their own memoirs, publications that are more carefully managed, more politically filtered, and less analytically specific than the interview transcripts that the classification system has been keeping from public view. When the declassification process begins to work through the foreign military studies outputs in the 1970s and beyond, the picture that emerges differs from the memoir picture in specific and important ways. The interviews are more candid, more analytically specific, and more admiring about American performance than the published memoirs, because the interview format has allowed the German officers to say things that the public memoir format, which carries its own political and professional considerations. When the program's outputs begin to be declassified and made available to historians through the 1970s and 1980s, the picture that emerges of what German generals privately thought about the American soldier in 1944 is significantly different from what the public record of the wartime period had suggested. July 25, 1944. Saint-Lô, Normandy. The largest aerial bombardment in support of a ground operation in the history of warfare is about to be dropped on Panzer Lehr Division's positions along a 7-kilometer front that the American First Army's planners have designated as the point of the Cobra breakout. Fritz Bayerlein has been living in the Normandy Bocage for 7 weeks, conducting the grinding defensive fighting that the Normandy campaign has settled into after the initial landings, and that has been consuming German divisions at a rate that cannot be sustained without the replacements that the depleted German training pipeline is not producing in adequate numbers. He has 3,000 soldiers and approximately 60 operational tanks on the day of the Cobra bombardment, and when the 2,430 American heavy bombers and medium bombers arrive and begin dropping approximately 4,000 tons of bombs on the positions his division occupies, the experience that Bayerlein describes in his Foreign Military Studies interview is an experience of such complete physical annihilation that the word bombardment fails to capture what it represents to the men who are in it. The earth is moving, not shaking, moving, in the specific and horrifying way that multiple simultaneous detonations of very large bombs move the earth when enough of them are detonating close enough together to make the ground itself unstable. Bayerlein is in a command post that has been built into the Norman Bocage with the specific engineering of men who have been preparing defensive positions against Allied attack for 7 weeks and who have buried their command facilities deep enough in the Norman earth that the direct hit that would destroy the position has a specific and limited probability of occurring. The probability exists. The bombs are landing close enough to the command post that the ceiling is dropping dust with each detonation, and the candle flames in the lanterns are guttering in the shock waves that the blast transmits through the earth itself. Men are pressed against the walls of the command post with the specific and instinctive body posture of men who understand that they are in a place where large objects are trying to kill them, and that there is nothing they can do about it but wait and hope. Outside, in the positions where Panzer Lehr's infantry and tank crews have been living and fighting for 7 weeks, the experience is not the experience of waiting and hoping. It is the experience of men who are in the open, in fighting positions that have been sighted and improved for the threat of ground attack, and that have not been sighted and improved for the threat of 2,000-pound bombs landing within 50 meters. In a world that has become noise and overpressure and flying earth, and the specific and total sensory annihilation that high explosive produces at close range. Biolines estimate that 70% of his effective strength is knocked out in the bombardment, is the estimate of a man who has walked through his positions afterward and has counted what he has left. The men in the forward positions are dying not from direct hits, but from concussion, from the specific physical effect of blast waves on human bodies that have no external wound and that are nonetheless lethally damaged in the lungs and the brain by the shock of air moving at the velocity that nearby detonations produce. Bioline estimates that 70% of his effective strength is knocked out in the bombardment, killed, wounded, or so disoriented by concussion that they cannot fight. And the 30% that remains is attempting to organize a coherent defensive response with the command communications that the bombardment has destroyed, and the vehicles that the bombardment has burned, and the artillery that the bombardment has buried in collapsed positions. The American infantry of the 30th Infantry Division and the 1st Infantry Division begins advancing through the smoking craters of Bioline's former positions at 1100 hours. What Bioline's surviving defenders do, and what Bioline will describe in his interview as the single most professionally impressive moment of the American performance in Normandy, is not the bombardment itself, whose scale and effect he had not projected as achievable on the timeline the American Air Forces have achieved it. It is what happens when the bombardment ends and the American infantry begins to advance through positions that his defenders have managed to reach and are attempting to hold, despite the concussion and the communication failures and the burning vehicles and the craters. The American infantry does not stop at the crater line. It does not consolidate on the objectives the bombardment has created. It advances through the positions, continues past the initial objectives, and exploits the dislocation that the bombardment has produced with a tactical aggressiveness that Bioline's professional judgment rates as the specific and defining characteristic of American ground combat in 1944. The ability to exploit success at the speed that success demands, rather than at the speed that administrative consolidation permits. The near failure in the German professional assessment of the American soldier, the moment that the foreign military studies interviews come closest to validating the dismissive pre-war assessment of American military capability, rather than revising it upward, is the American performance at the Hurtgen forest from September through December 1944. General Hans Schmidt, commanding the German forces in the Hurtgen, provides in his foreign military studies interview a detailed assessment of the American tactical performance in the forest fighting that is the most critical body of testimony in the entire program about American weaknesses. The Hurtgen is a forest of enormous tactical advantage to the defender. The trees that the artillery shells fuse against, creating airburst detonations that rain shrapnel downward on troops who would otherwise be protected by the ground. The narrow trails that limit vehicle movement and that infantry formations must follow in single file rather than in the mutually supporting assault formations that open terrain allows. The specific disorientation of close forest navigation that separates attacking units from each other and from the command and fire support systems that American combined arms doctrine depends on. In the Hurtgen, the American combined arms system's specific advantages, tactical air, massed artillery, the logistics system that sustains high-tempo operations, are partially neutralized by terrain that prevents their employment in the form that American doctrine has developed them for. And what Schmidt observes in the Hurtgen fighting is what he describes in his interview as the specific vulnerability that the American tactical system has not yet solved, the tendency of American commanders to continue employing a tactical approach that terrain has made unsuitable, rather than adapting the approach to the terrain at the speed that the mounting casualties require. American infantry divisions are being ground up in the Hurtgen at rates that the German commanders observing the fighting find professionally remarkable, not for the courage they represent. Schmidt rates the individual courage of the American infantrymen in the Hurtgen as exceptional, but for the institutional command decision that accepts those casualty rates in terrain where the tactical objective does not justify them and where alternative approaches are available. The near failure is real. The Hurtgen is the American Army's most costly single campaign of the European theater relative to the ground gained, and the German professional assessment of why it is costly is precise and honest. The American army has not adapted its combined arms system to the conditions where its primary advantages cannot be deployed, and has not done so as quickly as the situation has required. But the same interview program that documents this failure also documents what happens in the weeks and months following the Hurtgen, when the same American army applies what it has learned about the limits of its tactical system to the subsequent campaigns with a speed of institutional learning that Schmidt and the other German generals consistently identify as the American military's most impressive single characteristic, the ability to absorb a painful lesson and apply it faster than German military doctrine has expected any army to apply painful lessons. Schmidt's assessment of the post-Hurtgen American performance in the Rhine crossing of March 1945 and in the subsequent exploitation across Germany describes a force that has made specific and visible changes to its tactical approach based on what the Hurtgen has demonstrated, and that has made those changes in weeks rather than the months that the German doctrine assessment projected as the minimum implementation timeline for lessons that require revisions to unit-level training and tactical procedure. The Rhine crossing at Remagen, where the 9th Armored Division's forward elements capture the Ludendorff Bridge intact on March 7, 1945, and exploit the crossing with a speed that prevents the German defensive response from organizing before American forces are established on the East Bank in strength, is cited in multiple foreign military studies interviews as the specific American tactical performance that most exceeds what the German defensive planning had projected as achievable. The projection of what was achievable had been formed from years of experience watching American forces approach river crossings with the methodical preparation and consolidation before exploitation sequence that German observers had come to expect from the American operational style. Remagen departs from that sequence with the tactical improvisation and command initiative that the German doctrine had been telling its commanders the American army would not demonstrate. Remagen tells a different story. The Foreign Military Studies Program's interviews document the specific professional surprise with which German commanders received the news of Remagen's exploitation. What the German generals who participate in the Foreign Military Studies Program say about the American soldier in 1944, the assessments that the classification system keeps from the public for decades, and that historians access through the 1970s and beyond as the declassification process works through the program's outputs, is a picture of the American military in 1944 that differs from both the dismissive pre-war assessment and the triumphalist post-war narrative in ways that are equally important. The dismissive pre-war assessment, the view that American soldiers are untested civilians in uniform whose industrial democratic culture has not produced the specific military virtues that the German army's Prussian tradition has cultivated, is wrong by 1944, in ways that every German general who fought in Normandy and in the pursuit across France and in the Siegfried Line battles documents with specific operational evidence. The American soldier is brave. Every German general who participated in the program says so. The bravery is not the bravery of the trained professional soldier who has been doing this for years and has learned to manage his fear through the specific suppression mechanisms that long experience produces. It is the bravery of the citizen soldier who has been doing this for 1 or 2 years and who is afraid in ways that his face does not hide and that his actions do not reflect, who advances under fire in a state of visible terror and advances anyway, who takes the objective and then asks what to take next. This quality, the bravery of the man who is afraid and advances anyway, is, in the German professional military's assessment as recorded in the program, something different from what the German army's own tradition of military virtue has produced in its soldiers, and something that the German professional assessment, formed from that tradition, had not adequately projected, would be as effective in practice as the theory would suggest it might be in principle. The German army's tradition of military virtue emphasizes the professional soldier's management of fear through the specific suppression that training and experience and institutional culture produce. The Prussian conception of Haltung, bearing, as the visible demonstration of military professionalism, the controlled exterior that the trained German officer and NCO corps is expected to present regardless of the internal state it may be concealing, The American soldier of 1944 is not presenting Haltung in this sense. He is presenting something else, the specific and visible determination of a man who has decided that he is going to do the thing that needs to be done, regardless of what it costs him to do it, expressed in a way that makes no attempt to conceal the cost. German officers who observe this quality in the American soldiers they fight describe it with the specific professional appreciation of men who understand what it costs to advance under fire, and who recognize in the American soldier's advance a form of human performance that their own tradition has described and valued under different terminology, and that they are now encountering in the raw, undisguised form that the American military culture produces from a democratic society's citizen soldiers. Byerline's assessment of the American soldier at Cobra includes a specific observation that his foreign military studies interview records, that the American soldiers advancing through the bomb craters of Panzer Lehr's former positions on July 25, 1944 are advancing with a momentum that no force should maintain, through terrain that the bombardment has made maximally difficult, and that the maintenance of that momentum represents a form of unit cohesion under the most adverse conditions that his 30 years of professional experience have rarely seen equaled. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army in the Ardennes offensive, and the German commander who in the foreign military studies interviews produces some of the program's most analytically precise assessments of American military performance, provides in his interview the most compact summary of the German professional assessment of the American soldier. The American army learned faster than we expected, fought harder than our intelligence told us it would, and was sustained by a logistical system that had no equivalent in the experience of any German officer who faced it. Manteuffel's specific assessment of the American logistics system is the assessment that the interview program most consistently produces across its different German participants and different geographic and operational contexts. Every German general who has fought against American forces eventually arrives, in the interview discussion, at the logistics system as the factor that most exceeded his prior assessment of American military capability. It is not the Sherman tank, which is technically inferior to the Panther, in the specific comparisons that German armored doctrine uses to assess tank capability. The armor protection thinner, the main gun less capable at long range, the fire risk from the gasoline storage in the hull sponsons a specific vulnerability that German anti-tank crews have been trained to exploit. It is not the M1 Garand, which Soviet observers have also noted as impressive, but which German small arms assessments rate as a very good infantry rifle rather than a transformative capability. It is the trucks, the fuel, the ammunition, the capacity to sustain combat at a tempo that the German supply system cannot match and cannot interdict at the rate that would change the operational balance. General Siegfried Westphal, who serves as Kesselring's chief of staff in Italy and who participates in the program with an analytical perspective on the Italian campaign that covers 2 years of sustained combat against American Fifth Army, provides the most detailed assessment of American logistics in the entire program. He calculates, from the operational data available to him during the campaign, that American forces in Italy consume artillery ammunition per day at a rate approximately 3 times the rate that German forces consume in comparable operational conditions, and that this rate is sustained over months without the supply interruptions that German operations at comparable ammunition consumption rates would produce. The 3-to-1 ammunition consumption ratio is not a finding that Westphal offers as evidence of American profligacy. He offers it as evidence of a logistical system whose capacity has no equivalent in his professional experience. The first part, learned faster, is the characteristic that Manteuffel returns to most consistently, because it is the characteristic that most distinguishes the American Army of December 1944 from the American Army of November 1942, and the rate of that distinction's development over 2 years is what the German professional assessment most consistently identifies as the thing that their doctrine had no adequate framework for projecting. German military doctrine is built on the assumption that military excellence is the product of sustained professional development over years or decades of institutional investment, that the Prussian tradition of military education and the German army's specific approach to developing professional judgment in its officer corps is not replicable on the American timeline of mobilization from a peacetime army of 190,000 men to a wartime army of 8 million. The assumption is not entirely wrong. The German army of 1944 produces military performance at the individual and small unit level that exceeds the American army's equivalent performance in most direct comparisons. But the assumption fails to account for the rate at which the American army's institutional learning has been compressing the gap, has been taking the lessons of Kasserine and applying them at El Guetar, taking the lessons of El Guetar and applying them at Normandy, taking the lessons of the Hurtgen and applying them in the Rhine crossing, and the rate of compression is faster than the German professional assessment has projected as achievable. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, the German military's last major offensive effort in the Western Theater, provides the Foreign Military Studies program with its most detailed German assessment of the American soldier, under the specific conditions that most test an army: unexpected attack, initial disaster, the requirement to hold and then counterattack, without the preparation time that American doctrine prescribes, for both defensive and offensive operations. The American performance at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe holds an encircled perimeter against German pressure that General der Panzertruppen Heinrich von Luttwitz describes in his interview as the maximum pressure available to his XLVI Panzer Corps in the specific operational context of the Bulge's third day, is described in the German assessments with the specific professional admiration of commanders who had calculated that Bastogne's fall was a near certainty given the operational situation, and who have found the calculation wrong in ways that require explanation. The explanation that the German generals offer in their foreign military studies interviews is the explanation that the individual American soldier provides: the willingness to hold a position that the professional military calculation says cannot be held for the time that holding it requires, against the force that is pressing it, because the alternative, not holding it, is the unacceptable alternative. McAuliffe's famous one-word response to the German demand for surrender is a public record. What the German officers who received that response say about it in the foreign military studies interviews is not that the response is not merely defiance, but professional assessment, the assessment of a commander who has calculated the situation and concluded that his position is defensible against the force opposing it, and who is communicating that calculation in the shortest form available. What the German generals admitted privately about the American soldier in 1944 is not that the American soldier is better than the German soldier in individual combat. It is that the American army's rate of institutional learning, combined with the logistical system that sustained its operational tempo, and the combined arms system that multiplied its fighting power beyond what any individual soldier's quality could produce, made the American military by 1944 something that German doctrine had not prepared German commanders to fight effectively against. They say this in the interviews. They say it clearly. They say it with the professional honesty of men who are no longer required to say anything but what they believe to be true. And the document they leave, classified for decades, read by historians slowly and incompletely as the declassification process works through its backlog, is the most honest professional assessment of the American soldier that the most professional army in the world's most destructive war has ever produced. Not a tribute, not a surrender, but the specific and measured judgment of men who spent 1944 trying to stop something that turned out to be unstoppable, and who understood, more clearly than any army that is still winning can understand, exactly why.